Everyone, welcome to AskTOM Database Security for April of 2020. The topic this month is going to be Oracle Label Security. I am extraordinarily glad to be joined by Alan Williams. Alan is the product manager for data-driven security, and that includes database vault, label security, real application security, virtual private database, centrally managed users, enterprise users. Basically, if it isn't TDE or Audit Vault, it's probably Alan's stuff. And also Rich Evans. Rich Evans is the outbound product manager for North America, which already makes him an interesting guy. But even more interesting is before joining Oracle, Rich worked for the Department of Defense and has a lot of real-world experience with label security. So really happy to have both of them here. We'll get into the technical topic in just a minute, but first just a few things. If we talk about anything that's coming in an upcoming release, that's just us talking. That doesn't mean it's a commitment. You should always buy software based on what it does now, not what someone says it'll do later. This call is being recorded. I'll have the recording up on the AskTOM website, usually a couple of days after we finish up. I've got to submit it, and then it gets reviewed to make sure there's nothing bad, and then it goes up. So you'll probably be able to see it Monday or Tuesday if everything is right with the world. We do these calls just to give you a direct path into product development. It also gives us a chance to set up some continuing education on database security. It is a very broad field. There's a lot of things you can do with database security. And, you know, we do 10 of these sessions a year. We don't do them over the Christmas month, or we usually don't do them the month of the open world. But 10 of these sessions a year, and we barely get a chance to fit everything in that we want to do. We always do 2 of these. This is the second one. And the format for this is we'll go through, we'll do announcements, we'll do a technical presentation, and then Q&A. During the session, please enter into Q&A. You should see a little button down at the bottom of your screen. Any question you may have, we'll try and answer those during the session if we can, and then we'll review them at the end so that everyone can hear the answers. Okay. First, those announcements. Product updates. One of the big updates is that if you are using Oracle DataSafe on your security assessment page, you will now see a new column called Differs from Baseline. And what we're doing here is you can take a prior assessment, set that as your baseline, and if later on something changes, the little no that you see there in Differs from Baseline will change to yes, at which point you can go in and see what has changed. Now, one caution, this is a new feature. We just rolled it out earlier this week on the 6th. So if you have a security assessment that was run before we rolled out the baseline feature, you can't make that assessment part of a baseline. Your assessment has to have been done on the 6th or later for it to be eligible to be a baseline. If you do select an older assessment, the error is pretty self-explanatory. You can see it here on the screen. But once you have your baseline set, whenever somebody does something that would change the security status and you run a new assessment, what you'll see is a yes in that column. And when you click on that yes, you'll get a report that looks like this. It'll tell you something has changed. It could have gone up or down. You know, up is more secure, down is less secure. And you'll see exactly what has changed. Somebody removed some privileges, somebody added privileges, somebody unlocked a user. Whatever was changed, you'll see it here in your comparison report. That makes DataSafe a lot more usable for its security assessments. Without this feature, what you had to do was run an assessment and go through every single page of the assessment looking for changes. It was a very manual process, much nicer with what we've got now. Other change we did, not quite as earth-shaking as the comparison feature. When you configure an audit trail for DataSafe, the audit trail says, I'm going to go collect audit data from this target. And when we collect the data, we will collect all of the data on that target. Now within DataSafe, you set a retention interval, and that retention interval defaults to 12 months. So let's suppose that you have a database up in the cloud that has 5 years of audit data on it, and you say, I'm going to go out and I'm going to collect data. My retention interval is 12 months. What DataSafe will do is it will retrieve all 5 years of data, and then at the next interval, the next job where we check to see when there's data that has gone beyond the retention interval, it would remove the prior 4 years. So that hasn't changed. Here's what has changed. If you turn on auto purge, we now give you a warning that says this is what's going to happen. It may have been obvious before, it may not have, but we just want to make sure you understand that if you purge, what's going to happen is everything that is older in your audit trail than the last time we collected gets purged. So what you could wind up doing is purging that 4 years, and because it doesn't meet your retention interval, that's not saved in DataSafe. And so you've lost that 4 years of audit data. So what we, again, the default, not to auto purge, and if you try and turn auto purge on, you will see this warning come up, and you'll have to click register to continue to make sure you understand the warning. Other product announcement, we have a project that Alan's been working on for quite a while, and this is certification of Database 19, including Database Vault 19.1 with eBusiness Suite. That's now complete. So if you are running eBusiness Suite and you've been waiting to go to Database 19.1 because you needed Database Vault to be certified, that is now done. You can see the MOS note that covers that certification here on the screen. You'll see, as typical with these, the note itself, the scripts to implement the Database Vault within eBusiness Suite, very detailed instructions on how to set it up. We're really happy to get this out the door. In the support corner this month, today's topic is label security. There's 2 notes that you should be aware of. One of those is label security concepts and examples. Alan's getting ready to go through, because this is the last slide before I turn it over. Alan is getting ready to go through a description of label security, where he's going to talk about, these are groups and all kinds of concepts that you may not have run across before. If you would like a little more reading on it, this note gives that to you along with a step-by-step example. The next one is label security, how to separate duties of policy administration. After Alan finishes, Rich is going to go through and he's going to show you a step-by-step example, a couple of examples of using label security. And in those examples, he's going to create policies and he's going to set labels. Sometimes you want the same person to do both, but sometimes you may want separation of duties there. This note talks about how to implement that separation of duties. And not really in the support corner, but just something to keep in mind. We do a lot of work to keep our documentation up to date. The documentation for label security is chock full of examples and explanation. So if you are working on a label security product, it's worth your while to go out and look at the administrator's guide. This isn't the documentation you may have seen 3 or 4 years ago. The documentation has improved significantly around label security. So please take a look at that. And with that, Rich, I'm done. I think it's Alan's turn.
Great. Thank you very much, Russ. Do I have control? Yes, I do. Great. Okay, I'm Alan Williams. Been with product management in Oracle for the last 6 years. Before that, 9 years at Oracle, working as a consultant for National Security Group, working on national security programs that used products like Database Vault and Label Security. So let's just jump into this. So Label Security is part of a group of products and technologies I call application data security. You will also we'll say that's data-driven security. You'll see that as a pillar or as a group of products and technologies in Oracle. And so application data security is the next level of access control on your data. your regular database privileges and roles give you access to tables and views and such, but it doesn't differentiate what rows and columns a user can see, because application users typically don't need to see every single row and column. There's sensitive data, and that they don't need to see that. So application data security or application authorization is the set of authorizations allow them to, where we give cell level access, row and column level access. So here's an example. This is an internal HR lookup contact system where employees that in a company can view public information about other employees in the company, but they can also view their own record, update their own contact information. And so they can see their own, in this example, Nancy can see her social security number and her own salary. And that makes sense. And that's another business rule that's applied on top of the rule that employees can view public information. A manager can also view salary of his or her reports. It's another business rule that's on top of there. There could be other business rules as well, saying, well, an HR manager can see the social security numbers for the people in their particular group. So there's these are the type of rules we're talking about for application authorization. Now, what typically happens with application data security is that enterprise users log into the business application, and the application actually creates all these authorization checks. Well, it says this Joe user has this particular role, and that role has access to these columns and these rows. And then the application connects via what we call a fat pipe, which means that it's a database user, an account connection for that application, has all the privileges and roles for that application to act on behalf of every user that connects to it. So it's usually a very highly privileged account. Now, because every application then has to have their own authorization mechanism for the users to access the same data. What happens is many times the BI tools have a very different model of data access than what you can get through the enterprise application. Or it could be one is done by an ISV and the other one is a custom application in-house. And so the security model for what users can access through one application may be very different than what they can access through another application. And of course, if you log in directly to the database, you don't have any of the application authorizations, only the database account privileges and roles are apply to that particular user. And in many cases, if the application doesn't pass the user context along, there is no end user information in the audit. And so a lot of merging has to go along between the application audit and the database audit to find out what really happened. So those are some of the challenges with that. We also found in talking to a customer that 20% of any of their application development, the custom development they do in-house, is around authorization for that, the authorization checks. Now, if you centralize this this application authorization, what you do is you can save time for each application. You can centralize it so you have a common authorization mechanism for a user coming in from different areas, also from Direct Connect SQL Plus applications. The context will be set in many cases by the application then, and that information will be available in audit. So it's a simpler mechanism. You get higher security, and you get to save time with custom business application development. So that's that covers the application security, data security space. We have 3 technologies and products in that. We have VPD, Virtual Private Database, which we've had since over 20 years now. Label Security, which was built soon after that, and a new one in 12C that we released called Real Application Security, which supersedes Virtual Private Database. And so These three are what we consider the application data security technologies and products. And so we're going to focus on label security, and it's a very unique feature, a product, in that it works with these things called labels, and we'll talk about labels. So what is a label? Well, a label can be like confidential, sensitive. You've seen, if you've any movies, or if you've been involved in military intelligence, it's just like the top security or so confidential labels that that can be assigned to a user. So somebody has top secret access. So a label is created and then conferred upon a user. And in this case, you also have data that gets labeled with a sensitivity. So both the users have a label and the data has a label. And because of that, you have an ability for the database to automatically mediate if the user can see that data. In this case, sensitive is a higher classification level than confidential. And so this a user with confidential will not be able to see data that is with a sensitive label. So you don't have to write any procedures to do the mediation. That's automatically done based on your labels. Now, what is a label? Now, label security was built for military and intelligence purposes, and they have a highly evolved set of components for levels, compartments, and group that comprise their particular labels. And but we find that commercial customers have frequently found that that these can also be used for their particular needs. And I have actually way more commercial customers buying and using label security than I do with government projects at this point. So levels, with the military side, you'd have the top secret and confidential. In the commercial side, it could be sensitive, highly sensitive, confidential, or public information. Compartments, what you can use to secure specific projects within your company, saying unless you have access or allowed to see information on project A, you will not see information on project A. So you have to get specific allowance to see that. Groups are similar to compartments, except you can have any one of the group tags in that label to be able to see that information. In fact, you also have hierarchical setup with the group. So if you have worldwide group for a user, and they can see any of the data under the groups that are underneath that particular group. So that's the three components of a label. Let's see its use in a particular example. This is a pharmaceutical company. They have a number of drugs under evaluation. Each of the drug tests have their own particular compartment label, A, B, C, D, and E. In terms of levels, they're all highly sensitive because access to this can drive a stock price up and down. And this is the data label for for each record about drug A, B, C, D, and E. I mentioned a user also has labels. In this one, this user has the highly sensitive level, but also has access to information about A, B, and D. So this person will be able to get access about these three drugs, but not the other two. And these other two don't show up as crossed out or null. They don't show up at all. You'll notice the sequel doesn't change. It's still the same sequel, but they get a different set of data. So you don't even know that you're missing data that's out there. So OS only retrieves the authorized data records. So some things to know about label security. So it controls the display of the table rows using the labels. So each row has a data label. It's a hidden column, so your application doesn't need to be changed, and allows you to access and apply to the sensitive data in a particular table. Now, if you're familiar with label security prior to 12c, you have to relink You get to relink the database kernels. Starting with 12c, it's built in, and so all you have to do is run an API command to enable label security. And I mentioned this before, it is SQL query transparent. It's a hidden column that adds the data label, and so it'll still, the same data, a SQL query will return a different set of rows for each user, depending on their user label. And we have a full set of APIs, is typical for all the database features. And you can also manage label security using Enterprise Manager Cloud Control. And the labels for the user labels can also be integrated with Database Vault as factors, advanced security data redaction, and real application security. And it is very similar as VPD if you're familiar with the virtual private database. If you need to know the end user context, then the application does need to set the context. And it could be a system context, it could be an application specific context. But in some cases, it's just the application that needs to have a label. End users may not need to have a label. For example, in the case of like a GDPR, where marketing is not allowed to see, a marketing application is not allowed to see any data associated with customers that have not given consent. So, and the consent information could be part of a label. And so just a marketing app in general cannot see anyone that doesn't give consent. So it doesn't have to be at the user level, it can be at an application level. So, but if it is at the user level, the application does need to set context. And it is a licensed product to the database for the Enterprise Edition. Whereas Virtual Private Direct Database, VPD, and Real Application Security, they are part of the database Enterprise Edition. All right, some use cases. And hopefully these will, if you don't have a particular use case, maybe these will help trigger some information that helps you work with the application teams to use label security. Obviously in the public sector, every DoD and three-letter agency uses OLS, and that's to share data from one organization to another. They've come up on a standardized set of labels so they can pass data from one to another. And this has been accredited, certified and accredited. OLS many times over the last over 20 years by NSA and other accrediting agencies. So if you use OLS, it is an NSA certified product. In the world of healthcare, data access is a big deal. Who can see whose data in an organization, in a healthcare provider. VIP data separation. Instead of just auditing and saying, oh, you shouldn't have looked at that celebrity data, you can actually block that with label security. You've seen news releases of information about a celebrity in a hospital, and it's a very sensitive subject for hospitals, and this label security can block that access and only allow authorized users to see the VIP data. And we talked about hospitals, and they got the HIPAA considerations. There's other privacy regulations like GDPR and CCPA, the California one, and other ones around the world. And these can be, label security can be used to mark consent, the right to be forgotten, allows it to, data to be used by different applications and to be processed, to be forgotten or anonymized. It's something that a number of customers are looking at for their privacy implementation. Another commercial and retail use, OLS is commonly used to be able to implement regulations, guidelines where a government working with a commercial company may say, well, only citizens of our country can see data of our procurement from your company. And so you label the data saying this is the government data, and then label the user saying, okay, this is a citizen, this is not a citizen, allows them to properly secure the data. And that's a very common use case of label security with companies. Also, because of the group nature, the hierarchy with the group label, the group component of the label, we've seen some retail companies consolidate. These have an application and database for every store, but that made reporting difficult, and also you had to have DBAs and a lot of administrators for each one of these stores, they can consolidate this and still maintain the same data separation, data security for each store by using label security to maintain the separation, yet allow the worldwide company to be able to pull data for their reporting. Financial services has some of the similar type of requirements. Some customers say their financial accounts can only be managed by citizens in the same country, and so you can use label security to help manage that and make sure that the access is controlled. And this is also used by some very large ISVs, cloud ISVs that have their that have large applications in the cloud, but they don't create a separate application for every customer. They actually use label security to have the same application, the same database, serve out the customer-specific data with OLS. So those are common use cases that we've seen. All right, Rich, I can turn this over to you now.
Sounds good. Thanks, Alan. Appreciate it. And like Russ said, my name is Richard Evans, and I'm an outbound product manager. And in a previous life, I did work on label security. So I worked for a government customer, and we did label rows. We had an application that would control access based on your clearance level, your compartments, and your groups. So for today's demonstration, we're going to walk through my demo environment that is an Oracle 19c Enterprise Edition multi-tenant database on Oracle Linux. I already have Oracle Label Security configured and enabled because it does require a reboot for it to take effect, and that reboot would take 3 or 4 minutes to complete. So I've already done that for us. We're going to have our demo application here with one table. It's a very simple application. It's a customer relationship management type of application. Our table customers has our customers that we want to market to. And so we're going to use that table and control access to that table. We're going to have 2 demo users. CRM Brian is a user from the United States, and he only needs to access USA-based customers. And Pam is a CRM user from Europe, and she needs to access users in EMEA. Now, I've created an administrative user called LBAC Super, and this user has the LBAC DBA privileges, so it can manage label policies, create levels, groups, compartments, and set user labels. I've also given this user DBA privileges so he can view the CRM data. Now, my asterisk here says, basically don't do this. I'm doing this for simplicity in the demonstration, but if you're going to work with label security or really any application, you want to use the least privilege model and limit how many privilege a user has and control it and make sure they only have what they need to perform their job. All right, so our first, just to kind of reiterate what Alan said, is an OLS policy must consist of 1 level. It can't have multiple levels at the same time. You may have unclassified, confidential, secret, and top secret as levels, but only one of those is applied to the data at any given time. You can have 0 or more compartments on your policy and 0 or more groups. So the only thing that is really required for label security is 1 level. All right, so for our example, that 1 level we called default. We're just gonna call it D for short. Our first use case, we're gonna have 0 compartments, but we're gonna have 5 groups to create a hierarchy based on a region of the world. So we're gonna have global, USA, EMEA, and Japan. And this is a parent-child type of relationship here. This is a hierarchy. So if you have the global group, then you automatically have access to USA, EMEA, Japan, and data about customers in France. So what we're going to do is we're going to create an OLS policy, a level, and our groups. We're going to create and apply user and data labels. Remember, Alan talked about users having labels and then the row data having labels. We're going to create those. And then we're going to demonstrate Brian and Pam's access before and after label security. So here's kind of a demonstration of what it'll look like. So if we query our crm.customers table as the CRM user, this user will have default level, with global group access. So the CRM application can see everything. So this CRM application will see the users in France, USA, and Japan. If we log in as Brian, Brian's user label is default USA. Brian will only see our customer from the United States. Brian does not have privileges to see users in France or Japan. We didn't change the query. We didn't add a where clause or a predicate or anything. We just simply changed, we changed Brian's user label, right? Or we granted Brian user label access. Our Pam user, Pam has EMEA access. So in this table here, she's gonna see the customer from France, but not the customer from the USA or Japan. All right, so let's go through and start with that use case number 1. And I'm gonna do this on the fly here. So we're gonna come over to my test VM and we're gonna log into where my scripts are. Let me minimize this here and make this a little larger if I can. All right, so I'm gonna first create the CRM application data. I've created the CRM user. I've granted it resource connect. I've created my table, my CRM customers table here. And then I've inserted 50 rows into it. So we do the grant, we create the users, we alter the session, and here we can see what we can see for CRM customers. We return 50 rows. Now what we want to do is create our demonstration users. So we're going to create Brian. Brian has select on the CRM customers table. We connect as Brian. Brian selects 50 rows. We do the same thing with Pam. We connect as Pam. Pam also sees 50 rows, right? So they're all seeing the same data today. Now we're going to set up our super user. And remember, this is a user that I'm using for demonstration purposes. If I was going to do this in a production environment, this user would not have both DBA and LBAC DBA privileges. This user would probably have LBAC DBA privileges so they could manage the label security policies, but we don't want them to go see the data, right? So there's different use cases here. That's one of the nice things about label security is the flexibility that it gives you. So you can give a user a lot of privileges, or you can minimize those privileges and make sure that you have separation of duty. It really depends on how your company operates and if you have that capability to basically isolate and minimize privileges, roles, responsibilities. So our LBAC super user, when connected, also sees 50 users from our CRM customers table. Okay, the first thing we have to do with label security is to create our policy. The database can have multiple policies. So we could have a policy for our HR schema, a policy for our finance schema, a policy for our intellectual property, our CRM. We could have multiple policies within the same database that apply to different data. So what I use is I use the LBAC sysdba package. I run the create policy procedure. I give it a policy name, and then I'm going to define the column name that I want to apply to this table. So the column name that'll get added to all of the tables that I'm controlling with label security, that column will be called OLS label. I've got default options in here. So by default, when this policy is applied to a table, it's going to control read, it's going to control write, it's going to set a label default, and that label default is based off of the user who is inserting or updating data to that session. So if Brian is inserting data, Brian's data will be labeled with default and the group USA. If Pam is inserting data, that data will be labeled with the default level and the group EMEA. And then what we also want to do here is we want to hide this OLS column. So we can do that with label security where, let's say that the query wasn't properly written, it was a select star from table. We want to make sure that we don't affect that query, and we can hide that from being viewed in a describe or when you select statement. So if we want to see that OLS label column, we have to directly query that column. I typically start out with my policy disabled because once we enable a policy and we apply it to a table, then that table is under OLS control. And if rows in that table don't have a label, then by default, label security protects that data and does not show it to anyone unless they have a full privilege, right? Unless they have a special privilege within label security. So I want to disable the policy so I can work with this label data. All right, now that we've done that, let's create our group, or I'm sorry, our level first. Let's create our level. So again, we're going to use our components. We're going to create a level. We're going to give it the policy name, the level number, the short name, and then the long name. So this is kind of, I guess, matrix mathematics, I would say, right? So levels have policy numbers, compartments have numbers, groups have numbers, and then those numbers work together to identify, what it is, and then you can see which labels can dominate other labels. So if you have a label higher, then you can see the data. If your label is lower, then you're not going to see the data. So if you're gonna go with label security, look at the documentation, and there's information on numbering strategies, how you should set this up, kind of give you some ideas, some guidance on where to get started with it. But for my example, I gave it a level number of 1,000, and that works for that. All right, so let's go ahead and create our groups. We create our groups, and I'm going to scroll up just a little bit here so we can see what that is. Again, we're using the SA components. We're going to create a group. I've given it a group number, a short name, a long name, and then my parent for this is null because global is the top group in the hierarchy. I've created the USA group under global, the EMEA group under global, England under EMEA, France under EMEA, and Japan under global. And when I query the view in OLS, I can see that parent-child relationship here. So global, my EMEA, France, England, Japan, USA, and see what their parent is, okay? So now, just to kind of summarize what we've done so far, we're looking at the policy. The policy is currently disabled, but when it gets applied to a table, it's going to control read, insert, update, delete. Those are a part of that write control. It's going to apply a label default based on the user session, and it's going to hide that column that it applies to that table. We've created that one level default. We don't have any compartments in this first use case, but we do actually have 6 groups. So we have 6 groups here that we're working with. So now I want to create the labels. So these labels are what we are going to apply to users or to data. So here you can see I'm using my SA label admin package. I'm executing create label. I've got label tags. So again, this is if you're numbering your tags, you may want to create, EMEAs in a certain range. You may want to create APAC in a different range, global in a certain range. So you might have a labeling strategy here so your indexing can take advantage of that. Here I granted this a label tag of 6,800. I created all those labels as user or data labels. So that way I can apply this to a user like Brian, or I can apply this to a row in the customer's table. And then that row or that user will have this label tag associated with it. So Brian would have a user label of 4,000. My row that I insert into the database for default, the Japan group will have a label tag of 6,800. Okay. So now that we've created our label tags, our user data tags, what we can do is we can set our user labels. So what we want to do, and I'm going to scroll up a little bit again here, is we are going to set our CRM user to be default and then the global group. So that way their max read label, the highest they can read everything in here because we don't have any group above the global level. So our application user, CRM, will be able to read all of the data in the table today. And so if we look at our users, we have, let me see if I can run this again and get this all on the same screen. We've got Pam. Pam has a max read label of default EMEA. Brian has a max read label of default USA. And one of the things about label security that we can do is we can actually decide that while that may be your max read label, on a daily basis, when you log in, you don't need to see that full data. And we're going to do that in use case 2. We're going to see a difference for CRM between their max read and write labels and what the CRM application's default read, write, and row labels are. So that way we can distinguish that. And that's all configurable, and you can change that during your session. So if you're working with an off-the-shelf application and you can understand what user's connecting, you can execute a procedure to set the session label for that user to modify it so it's below what that max read label is. Okay. All right, so we've done that. We've created the labels. We've set the labels. Now what we want to do is apply the policy to the table. We apply the policy to the table. You can see my before apply. My describe looks exactly the same as my after apply. So that way you can see here, we've hidden that OLS label column. We don't see that there. My policy on the table, CRM schema, customers table, is enabled. And here are the table options that came from the policy. So the policy applied these tables options to it. So we're going to control read, insert, update, delete. We're going to set a label default based on that user that is inserting or updating that data. And we're going to hide that column by default. Okay. So now that we have this on here, we don't see that column there yet, but we can start to label data because we know it's there as a hidden column. So we're going to start to label, let's say, our English data here. So we've got 50 rows in the table. 5 of those rows are for England. We're going to execute an update statement on it. We're going to set the OLS label column, and we're going to use this toDataLabel function. We're going to give it the policy name and then give it a character representation of what we want that label to be. We want it to be a default level, no compartments, and a group of England, where the country is equal to England. So now you can see our OLS label is 6500. That was one of those ones that we pre-created with our label tag. Then we have 45 rows that are empty. Those are not visible yet. Those have not been tagged. So let's go ahead and label those additional 45 rows. Label data. I'm going to scroll up just a little bit here. All right, so we can see we've got 50 rows in the table. 13 of those are customers from the United States. We update 13 rows with our OLS update statement. Now we have 13 rows with an OLS label of 4,000. And if I convert that to a character format, you can see it's a default level, no compartments, and a group of USA. We've got 32 rows still unlabeled. 26 of those 32 are customers in France. We're going to label those. Now we can see we've got a 6600 label here, and we are down to only 6 rows that aren't labeled. We label those. Those customers are from Japan. And here you can see we've got that 6800 that we looked at, that we set when we set that, that label tag. And we can see 6 of those get the default level and a group of Japan. So now we've got all of our rows labeled in this table. Now that we've got that, we can do a query just to make sure we can see what Brian sees beforehand and then what Pam sees, and then we'll enable this policy. So as expected, Brian sees all the records. He has select on the table. We don't have that policy enabled yet, so Brian sees everything. His read label and write labels are default USA. He can see a breakdown of all the customers by region and what their labels are. Pam can see the same thing. When Pam does a select statement, it's exactly the same thing. It's just using her login instead. 50 rows. Her read and write labels are EMEA, which also include England and France. So that way she can see data for those customers. And then let's go ahead and run it as our CRM user. So we can just verify, yep, the CRM application sees 50 rows. The CRM application has read and write labels that include everything. So default level, we don't have any compartments, but they have the global group. Therefore, they have all of the groups underneath global. All right, now let's enable our policy. Enable. Our policy went from disabled to enabled by executing the SA sysdba enable policy. We told it which policy we want to enable. Now when we execute our Brian query, Brian sees 13 rows instead of 50. Brian's read and write labels are USA, and the country data that he sees is United States. What about Pam? When we run Pam and we see what Pam select looks like, Pam sees 31 out of 50 rows. Her information is EMEA, which includes England and France. And here we can see that we've got 31 rows labeled England or France. If we run the same query as our application account, we just want to verify that our application account sees all 50 rows. Yep, our application account has a customer count of 50, a read and write label that includes global, so it includes everything underneath global. We can see a breakdown by labels, and we can see a breakdown by countries. Okay, so let's go back to our PowerPoint slide here. So we've done everything in this first use case. We've created an OLS label. We've created the levels, the groups. We created and applied user and data labels. We demonstrated Brian and Pam's access before and after label security policy was applied. Our second use case is going to be around customers that have opted out or are inactive in our application. So we want to hide those customers from view, and we're going to do that by creating a compartment to hide those inactive rows so we don't have to modify our queries or modify the application. So to give you an idea of what that's going to look like, again, a policy must have one level, 0 or more compartments, 0 or more groups. We have one level named default. We now have one compartment we're going to call forget, or FGT for short. And we have 6 groups to create the hierarchy based on the regions. So we've got England in there as well. So this is kind of what it looks like here. If we were looking at it visually, we basically have a copy of each. We have global, and then we have global and forgot. We have USA, USA and forgot, EMEA, EMEA forgot, etc. And they all have that default level associated with them. All right, so a query for CRM would look like this. That same query we saw in use case 1, where CRM saw all of the data, the CRM application would only see 1 out of 3 of these rows because 2 of these rows have an active status of no, so they should not show up to the application. Brian doesn't see any data anymore because Brian's only customer in the United States is inactive. Again, we haven't changed the predicate. We haven't changed any of the data. We haven't changed anything about the CRM users. We've added this. We're going to add this compartment to the row for inactive users. Pam will see 1 user here because her customer in France is active. So again, she would not have seen customers in the USA. She would not have seen customers in Japan. They are outside of her group, but she does see customers in France, and it happens that that customer is active. All right, let's go back to our demonstration. We can see our breakdown here. Let's go ahead and start to add in this compartment. So what we want to see is a breakdown of active versus inactive customers. So what we have 50 customers that CRM can see. We've got activity of no for roughly half of these, and then active yes for the other half. So what we want to do is we want to first create the compartment that we can apply to those inactive accounts. So again, we're using our SA components. We say create compartment. We give it a compartment number, just like we gave levels and group numbers and label tags. We've got a short name of FGT and a long name of forget. And you can see for this policy, we have 1 compartment. All right, if I show you the policy details, you can see we have our CRM demo policy. It's enabled. We can see our level. We've got our 1 level. Now we see that 1 compartment that got added, and we can see our 6 groups that we've already been using in the first use case. So now what we need to do is we need to update our CRM user so it can access this data if necessary. So what we do is we set the label for the CRM user, we give it a max read label, a max write label, and then we can decide what the minimum level is and then the default and the row level. Remember before I said you can modify what the defaults are versus the max? So here's a use case where you might want to have a different default read label, write label, or row label that differs from the max read label. For example, with CRM, when the application inserts data, we're okay with it inserting it at the global level and then working down and saying, oh, this customer is the United States. We may have a procedure associated with that to change that level, to change that label based on geographically where that data is. Or with a user who logs in, the session might change that data for that user, for Brian or for Pam. But there may be use cases where we need CRM to be able to read this data that is also inactive users. But by default, we don't need that user to read that, write that, or set that as the default level, right? We don't want CRM setting rows to be forgotten by default. We want it to be set at the maximum group level here. The other thing we can do is label security can allow you to grant privileges to users that are outside of levels. So if you have a data pump export or you have a user that's batch reading or batch updating data, you can give it privileges within the policy. So my super user here, not only is it an LBAC administrator, or a DBA, it is also going to have full privileges here. So it essentially bypasses the labels, and it can update the data. This LBAC super user can manipulate the labeled data without having a read, write, or a default label here. So we're going to use this super user to be able to activate our forgot columns, our forgot compartment. So what we're going to do is we're going to forget our inactive users. We've got our users here who will be forgotten. We've got an old label. So these users in England have this. Our new users have the forget England. Same thing with the users in France, Japan, and USA. And we do that by performing an update statement. There's lots of different ways to change these levels, these labels, but this is the way I've done it today is I'm creating a toData label, and I'm using a function that's built into OLS called least upper bound. It's going to take the existing label, it's going to compare it with our new label that we want to say, and it's going to say, oh, in order for me to meet this requirement, I'm going to have to combine the old label with our new default and forget compartment, and it turns into this new label up here. So I'm going to update those 27 rows, and now we can see all of our inactive users here have that compartment, forget. All of our active users are the way they were before by just having the groups associated with them. Okay, so now what happens if we query as Brian? Well, Brian now sees 6 rows. He used to see 13, he sees 6. His default read and write labels are the same. And here you can see he sees 6 of these users. Well, what about Pam? Pam used to see, I think, 31 users. She sees 16 now. Her read and write labels haven't changed. She sees only 1 user in England and 15 users in France. Now, what about the application? The application is going to see 23 out of 50 rows, because remember, 27 of those were inactive accounts, and by default, we don't want them showing up in the application. We could modify the read label, we could modify the write label for the session, and we could see that data, but on a day-to-day basis, there's no reason to show this data within the application. We don't want to make any application changes, and like Alan said, having so many different applications or tools or BI systems or backend processing systems touching this data, we can't rewrite those applications. We want to control access to this data at the database layer, at the data layer. So we can do that by labeling rows and then deciding, oh, you're coming in from this system. Okay, we can change your session label so you can see this. Or Nope, the application by default does not need to see forgotten users. So we're not going to display them to the application. All right, so that kind of concludes the demonstration here. So we created the policy, the level, the groups. We created and applied user and data labels. We demonstrated Brian and Pam's access before and after, as well as the CRM application. We identified that we had 27 rows of customers who had opted out and need to be hidden. So we created a compartment to hide those inactive rows so we didn't have to modify the existing application queries. All right, Russ, I think we are talking about data safe next month, aren't we?
That is the plan.
All right.
The goal is data safe, and if for some reason we can't, there's always a chance something slips, then our backup is database authentication, which is a topic we've been wanting to do for a while, but it's just hard to get it into the schedule.
Yeah, and that puts Alan back on the hook for next month too, right?
If we don't do data safe, that's right.
I don't know, Rich. I think this you can cover very well.
All right, what kind of questions did we have, Russ?
First question we got was from Saeed, and it was, how can we use label security? No, I'm sorry. First question we got was, label security adds a column to each table protected. How much space is needed by those columns? And the answer to that, Alan mentioned it, is that the label is converted into a 10-digit value to help the database quickly evaluate user and data labels. So what label security does is to every table that you apply a label security policy to, it adds a number 10 column to it. So very small impact on storage. The next question was, how can we use label security when an application uses a common user to access data? And the answer there is, at some point, the application has to tell the database who the end user is. It has to set some context to let it know what the session label is for the user. That can be done in sys context. It can be an application context. It doesn't really matter how that's done, but for the application to switch, it has to give the database that information. The third question we got was, is label security certified with eBusiness Suite or SAP? Yes, for eBusiness Suite. There's a great open world presentation where an Oracle consultant worked with NetApp to implement eBusiness Suite with labels. With SAP, you have to check SAP certification. We're not allowed to say what programs we don't own certify or don't certify. And there was one open question that didn't look like we got to during the session, and that is, the label security is hidden, but how does it affect explain plans?
Yeah, and that's a yes and no. It does take into account, it's like VPD. In some cases, it does take that into account, and others it doesn't. And we're expanding, what does get covered with the explain plans, but not everything is covered.
Mohammed asked if, Mohammed asked if a user is required to have more labels in order to see more data. In other words, if Pam needed both USA and EMEA. And I put a response in saying that the user really only needs one label, but that label would need multiple components. And I use the example of 1::: USA EMEA for that, and broke it down.
Yeah, I think that's one of the powerful things about label security is if you need to change those users' privileges like we did for CRM and grant them that forget compartment, like you can do that without rewriting business rules. So you can adjust the groups, you can adjust the compartments, you can adjust the levels, and then you can, if Pam needs access, if Pam now has taken over North America as well as EMEA, yeah, absolutely. Pam can have both of those groups.
Jim asked a question about Audit Vault. Does Audit Vault use label security? As far as no, we don't. Both Al and I answered this, I think, right about at the same time. It uses TDE and database vault, but not label security.
I'm assuming it uses VPD for any row level control there.
I believe so. I don't think it's using RAS either.
There was a
No.
follow-up question from Jim around audit, asking whether audit needs to stay in SysOx in order to do a logical recovery. Jim, to the best of my knowledge, that is not true. I am not a data guard guru, though. But as far as I know, you don't have to have audit in SysOx, and we recommend moving audit out of SysOx into its own table space. In a read-only database, unified audit goes to an external binary file and is automatically imported when the database becomes read-write again. So that's how we handle that need for read-write of SysOx. And finally, there's a question about removing old Audit Vault archives that are past the retention policy time. In the current release of Audit Vault, that's a manual process. That's one of our main targets for the upcoming release, Audit Vault 20, and you can look for that later this year. Carlos asks about DataSafe. Does it now support on-premises database, or is that a future feature? Carlos, we are in limited availability for that right now. What that means is we have it working, but we are looking for customers who are willing to work with us to test it. If you are, please send me an email. I'm russ.lowenthal@oracle.com, and we'd love to have you work with us. Requirements are database 11.2 or higher. We prefer 12C or higher. We can work with 11.2. And other than that, that's it. That's all I had, Rich.
All right, great.
Are there any other questions?
Did you answer Jim's question about, let's see, where'd it go? For set of
Oh
data
yeah, about yeah.
to be to restrict access. Yeah, it depends. For database vault, blocks at the entire, like if you're not allowed to access, like for privileged users shouldn't be accessing sensitive data in a table or view or schema, it can block that entirely at the object level. It can't. Database vault doesn't allow you to do like row level or column level security. So the VPD, RAS, and OLS, therefore, people that are allowed to have access to that table, but not necessarily all the data in that table. So that's kind of the way to differentiate that.
Twice. All right, Alan, Rich, thank you again. I know it's a long day for you, but we really appreciate you coming on. Great session, fantastic topic, and look forward to seeing you all next month.
Thanks everyone. Appreciate your time.
Thank you all for joining.
Take care.